Hi there. I just watched Professor John O'Quigley on 19 Nurses. I'm not sure how to begin this video. It's just... So, a lot of the first half is looking at the probability of presence of any particular nurse in relation to what have been chosen to be suspicious events. If those events aren't suspicious in and of themselves, but they've been chosen to be deemed as suspicious by people with an agenda because they want to blame a certain person for something happening in the unit as a whole, then what's the point in looking at probability of... as soon as you enter into their world being... certain individuals have this, initially in the hospital, Breary and co. They have this ability to decide, apparently, what is suspicious. What does that even mean, what's suspicious? It means, presumably, it means what's explainable, what's unexplainable versus what's explainable, what's unexpected versus what's usually expected. But that's all in their hands to decide, to determine, to create. They didn't discover. Nobody at the hospital, Evans, the police, the CPS, Nicholas Johnson, nobody discovered or found suspicious events to be happening. They didn't discover it. They weren't looking at everything happening in the unit over a period of time, saying, "Oh my God, look at all these suspicious events." No, that's not what happened. There are no suspicious events, effectively, in terms of it being suspicious for deliberate harm. That there are no suspicious events. This is where I'm thinking now after watching Professor John O'Quigley is, I'm not contesting anything he's saying. It's nothing to do with that. It's the world in which Lucy Letby was pulled into, which is a world within certain individuals can determine what is suspicious, and then you've got to then you're in this battle about saying, well, so what if I was there when this suspicious event happened? But the deeper question, the more fundamental issue is, was it suspicious? And what is suspicious? What is the nature of the suspicion? And what is that founded upon? And who's making the suspicion? It's a choice being made by certain individuals for a certain reason, for an agenda. They've created it. So I go back to what I was saying earlier. None of it's discovered. You don't discover the chart. You don't get all this stuff. Oh my God, look at that. I didn't realize it would work like that. Oh my God. No, everything is constructed. The whole notion of the suspicious event is constructed by every element of that persecution leading to the prosecution. Every part of it's constructed first by the Breary and his mates, and then further, and this is where the deep corruption comes in conjunction in this, which is something I've been saying for a long time. This triangulation between the police, Evans, and that group of bullying consultants. They construct that it can't be just one element of them. It has to be all three, because the police are the gophers between the two, between Evans and the consultants. And there's likely a direct route between consultants and Evans as well as being via the police. But it's always in that triangulation is working. The information is going back and forth in all directions in order to construct that roster chart. So Evans just builds on and essentially builds on what the consultants have already done. And then the police work that up, and then the quote-unquote suspicious events that maybe Evans comes up with. The police don't like the look of them. The consultants don't like the look of them. Sometimes it may be because Lucy Letby's not on duty. Sorry, maybe because she's not on duty. But other times maybe she is on duty. But there's another reason they don't like them. We don't know what those reasons are. I don't think it's pure caprice. I think there will be all reasons, and they're all utterly cynical. The point I wanted to make here is that, having just watched Professor Quigley's video there, playing into the concept of the suspicious event is the fallacy. Into the belief that there were events that were suspicious, because suspicion has to be housed somewhere, has to be housed in the person having the suspicion. Who are they? Why are they doing it? And on what basis are their suspicions constructed? Those are the questions that need to be asked. Now, I understand what Professor Quigley's doing there, and he's attacking it from both sides. He's looking at, he's addressing the shock value of the roster chart with Lucy Letby's X's all the way down, and saying, well, if you do these you approach it in a different way, then you could, the probability of presence it's not a slam dunk to say, well, this is, you can't fight this idea because look at all the X's, basically, because you need to take into account lots of other factors and the other nurses involved and how many shifts they were doing, etc. But you're already lost, in a sense, kind of doing that. You're in their world. You're in the world of made up suspicious events, constructed suspicious events. Well, they're not quote unquote suspicious events. You're in their language. You're in their determinations of what is suspicious and what isn't suspicious. And then the second half of the video goes into of the presentation from Professor Quigley goes a little bit more into the area that I'm talking about here, in which he says, well, you can do this, and he uses a mathematical calculation, a kind of, I don't know what it's called, but he works out, well, actually there could have been, I didn't quite follow what he was saying here, but he says he uses an estimate via this equation that you could actually, there weren't only 25, there were 96. And he said there could be more, there could be less, but there's definitely more. But that seems to me to be a fallacy as well, because, well, for something to be suspicious, it doesn't exist floating around in a cloud of suspicion on its own. It's being determined as suspicious by someone. And what does suspicion mean? I've said it before. It's like something that they can't explain. So in this context, it's something they can't explain by, well, this shouldn't have happened but for deliberate intervention, malicious intervention, i.e. a crime, i.e. a baby being attacked, or a machine being switched off, or a tube being removed. Nothing else would explain it by that. But who is it? Who is it that's having the suspicions? So the effect is, and I was sympathetic with what I really like Professor Quigley. I like his presentation. I think he's brilliant and everything. It's nothing. I'm not contesting him, but it's just getting to the root of this. It's not about saying, oh, well, actually, there were probably 96 or more suspicious events over the period of the indictment period. And actually, if you consider that, then that roster chart crumbles and it's meaningless, and you wouldn't. And if you showed that version with the 96 events, the jury would not be overwhelmed by it. It wouldn't say, oh God, well, they wouldn't go, oh God, well, it has to be her then. Do you see what I mean? You're already lost, because you're in the world of suspicious events that have been determined by people that want to find suspicious events, and it's their suspicion. It's not suspicion per se. It's not suspicion from the in terms of the majority of those deaths. It's not suspicion from the pathologist. George Kakai. It's not suspicion from him. It's suspicion from Breary and his mates that join in. And then it's a joint enterprise suspicion creation machine with the help of Evans and the police in this triangulation, which creates all this notion of suspicion. The thing that unless I've misunderstood from watching Professor O'Quigley's presentation there, is that it's still holding on to the notion of suspicion as though it's valid in and of itself, purely because it's asserted. And you have to look always who's asserting it. And the reality of this, and obviously this is what the panel does, it says, well, actually, these aren't suspicious. The events that you're blaming Nurse Lucy Letby for creating, and that's why you're suspicious. No, they're not suspicious at all. Things went wrong. The babies were in a certain physical, medical state which were not being addressed. You've got the problems of the unit as a whole, and there might be certain instances in which nothing could have been done anyway. And those are the reasons for these things happening. There never was, it should never have been nobody should have been in the cast of mind to be suspicious about them in the first place. You never actually, the suspicion has no foundation, never did, for deliberate harm. So to re-look at the roster charts and attack it by means of saying, well, there could have been more suspicious events that you didn't look at, I don't understand that, because I think it's about the notion of suspicious events at all. There's no suspicious events there. Things happened there. Everything happened for a reason. Now, you could construct it and say, well, I'm suspicious that I'm suspicious. A person thinking through this could say, well, I'm suspicious that actually this baby got sepsis because of the pathogens on the ward. You could do that, absolutely, yeah. But let's take the idea of deliberate harm out of it. There's no foundation for any suspicion. So, as I say, to attack that ridiculous roster chart on the basis of saying, well, actually, well, they didn't consider all the suspicious events. I can't grasp that, because I don't believe in the suspicious events vis-a-vis deliberate harm at all. And so from both sides of the presentation that Professor Quigley gave, I feel it's playing into the falsity. You're in a false world, and you're trying to say, well, if they had addressed this falsity in a slightly fairer way, they couldn't have come up with this roster chart. But it's missing the actual elephant in the room, in which all the idea of suspicion housed in the consultants, and then joint enterprise manufacture of suspicion very directly to a particular person, discarding all the ones that you thought, well, yeah, that I can, and this is what Professor Quigley does do towards the end of the presentation, is to say, well, yeah, well, and he's being ironic. He's saying, well, if there had been 96 suspicious events, well, what happens? How did they discard all those then? Because, because Lucy Letby wasn't on duty, and you wouldn't have been able to create that chart anymore. It'd all been, they wouldn't have had the story. They couldn't have created the narrative, and that's quite true. But it's still on the basis of believing in the concept of suspicious events, and that's the foundational lie of all this. That the events are suspicious at all. They're not suspicious, are they? So baby K, the wrong size tube being placed in, and the multiple intubations, and the wrong size tube, and Dr. Jayaram not knowing how to use the basics of the resuscitation machines, the capnograph, etc. Now, one could say, well, that could turn into a suspicious event about him making all those mistakes. Or you could just say it's just him not being a good doctor at all. But what none of it is a suspicious event that's pointing towards deliberate harm. So it's the whole notion of suspicion, actually, is the foundational falsity. Not the idea that you contest that roster chart that the jury were bamboozled by or defrauded them. It was an act of fraud. You don't contest that by fighting the idea, oh well, if you look at all the other nurses, the probability of presence isn't so absolute for Lucy Letby, because you're in their world of taking it on board that suspicious events exist. And then the other side of it, the second part of the presentation, is saying, well, there could have been more suspicious events. They didn't consider all those. No, there are no suspicious events. There are no suspicious events. And that's the foundational truth that actually blasts through everything. That's the thing that would tip up the totality of the fraud of it. Suspicious events, quote unquote, are solely mental constructs in the poisoned minds of certain individuals, which then grow into a collective of this utter fraud creature. Evans comes on board, and then the police are all making that happen, and they just work it up, and it's just totally worked up out of utter construction and fraud, not out of any justification for suspicion. So, and there we have it. You see, 'cause if there's no foundation for suspicion, then you can't have an individual coming in and saying, oh well, somebody did this, somebody did that, somebody did this, and this is what Evans did, and he changes his mind in midstream, because he can say anything then, because he's, well, I'm just going to fulfill. Evans's job then is to fulfill the suspicions that are based on nothing, and that's why it just becomes an utter fictional construct on top of these suspicions that are not based in truth, not in actuality, not in reality, but just totally in the mind of Breary and co. I hope that makes sense, sort of. What I'm kind of saying is there is a very foundational way to look at this, and it's not to do with saying there could be more suspicious events, and it's not to do with comparative probability of presence with other nurses. There are no suspicious events. Things went wrong. You could say, well, you could be suspicious about them, about the competence of the doctors, about the safety of the unit. You could be suspicious about that, but that's another world altogether. Thank you.